The Qualcomm Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 powers tons of mid-range smartphones launched in 2025, while the Qualcomm Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 was featured in several smartphones last year. While both chipsets are built on TSMC's 4nm fabrication process, several differences lie in the CPU structure and GPU. Also, if you're wondering, the Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 is not the direct successor to the Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, as Qualcomm uses the S branding for a tier lower processors. This comparison video shall give you an idea of how last year's chip fares against this year's highly popular chipset, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 versus Snapdragon 7 Gen 3. AnTuTu scores compared. AnTuTu analyses a device's overall performance by running individual tests on the CPU, GPU, memory, and UX to deliver a comprehensive score. Here's how the Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 and Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 fared in our AnTuTu test. Comparison is between Nothing Phone 3A with Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 and OnePlus Nord CE4 with Snapdragon 7 Gen 3. CPU, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, 261,376. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, 269,233. GPU, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, 201,797. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, 256,488. Memory, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, 170,686. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, 129,912. UX, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, 164,163. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, 163,714. Overall, AnTuTu score, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, 798,022. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, 819,347. CPU score represents the processing power of the device's CPU. GPU score measures graphics performance. Memory score evaluates the efficiency and speed of RAM and internal storage. UX score reflects the smoothness of the device in handling everyday tasks. Overall score, a combination of all component scores, providing a general idea of the device's performance. Number 2. Geekbench scores compared. The Geekbench app is used for rigorously testing the CPU and GPU performance of a chipset by running individual and multiple tests in quick succession. The score achieved after the testing session reveals the processor's raw performance capabilities. The testing results are Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 on single-core, 1179. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 on single-core, 1138. Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 on multi-core, 3311. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 on multi-core, 2950. Number 3. GFX Bench scores compared. GFX Bench tests the graphics quality of a processor by putting a load on the GPU. For this, the app consists of the Manhattan and T-Rex tests, which stimulate a 3D environment at the highest frame rates possible. Here's how the Adreno 710 and Adreno 720 GPUs of Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 and Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 fared respectively. Manhattan test, which ran for 30 minutes. Results are Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, 3,675 frames, 59 FPS. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, 3,730 frames, 60 FPS. T-Rex test result, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, 3,352 frames, 60 FPS. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, 3,367 frames, 60 FPS. Number 4. Phones with Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 and Snapdragon 7 Gen 3. Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 phones, Redmi Note 14 Pro Plus, Realme 14 Pro Plus, Realme P3 Pro, Nothing Phone 3a, Nothing Phone 3a Pro, Vivo T4, iQOO Z10, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 phones, OnePlus Nord CE4, Motorola Edge 50 Pro, Vivo T3 Pro, iQOO Z9S Pro, Honor 200, Vivo V50, Vivo V40, Vivo V30. Number 5. Specifications. Comparison. Launch date. Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, August 20th, 2024. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, November 16th, 2023. Process. Snapdragon 7S Gen 3, 4 nanometer. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3, 4 nanometer. Manufacturer. Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 TSMC. Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 TSMC cores, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 8, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 8. CPU structure, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 1, Cortex-A 720 core at 2.5 GHz, 3 Cortex-A 720 cores at 2.4 GHz, 4 Cortex-A 520 cores at 1.8 GHz, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 1 Cortex-A 715 cores at 2.63 GHz, 4 Cortex-A 715 cores at 2.4 GHz, 3 Cortex-A 510 cores at 1.8 GHz. CPU max frequency, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 1050 MHz, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 2630 MHz. Instruction set, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 RMV 9.2A, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 RMV 8.6A. Memory, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 LPDDR5 RAM, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 LPDDR5 RAM. Storage type, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 UFS 2.2 UFS 3.1, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 UFS 2.2 UFS 3.1. CPU bit, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 64-bit, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 64-bit. GPU, Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 Adreno 710, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 Adreno 720. Video recording, Snapdragon Gen 3 up to 4K at 30 FPS, Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 up to 4K at 60 FPS and 1080p at 120 FPS. FAQs. Is the Qualcomm Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 still a suitable processor in 2025 for gaming? Yes, the Qualcomm Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 continues to be a good gaming performer even in 2025. The synthetic benchmarks and real-world gaming performance showcase great numbers in our internal testing. Should I pick a Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 smartphone over Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 for gaming? The Snapdragon 7 Gen 3 may deliver a better gaming experience through higher frame rates. The Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 is not far off, as it can handle high-end games without much issues. Also, it's worth considering that newer phones with Snapdragon 7S Gen 3 launched in 2025 feature large-capacity batteries, which could go a long way in providing better endurance for long gaming sessions. Thank you for watching the video. Please do like, share, and subscribe my YouTube channel, Tech and Stocks Infomedia.